more than half of South Africans believe the country's police officials are corrupt. This is according to the findings of an Afrobarometer survey released on Friday, which also found that trust in the police has hit historic lows. For more on this, I'm joined by Ziyanda Stearman, author of Can We Be Safe? Ms. Stearman, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Now, these are quite astronomical numbers here, that more than half of South Africans believe that the country's police officials are corrupt. Give us perhaps some reasons as to why South Africans are feeling this way and what has brought us to this point of major mistrust.
Good afternoon, Tammy. I think that a large part of the explanation around such high numbers of perceptions of corruption amongst the police actually has to do with a lot of what's happening right at the top in terms of police leadership. So, somebody like our current police minister, Bheki Cele, is quite polarizing and has many fans in some ways, but also many detractors in other senses. There's also the fact that there's been a lot of tumultuous leadership changes, particularly within the role of the National Police Commissioner, where, since 1994, we've had 8 national police commissioners serve in that position, and 4 of them have been removed from that position, mostly being found guilty of fraud, corruption, and dishonest conduct. So the latest, I think, issues around Khehla Sitole, which have been months in the making as well, definitely contribute to this incredibly negative view of corruption amongst the police.
Do South Africans trust police to keep them safe?
The answer to that is no. At this point, truly historic low level, about 26% of South Africans say that they trust the police somewhat or a lot. If you look over the past 20 years that Afrobarometer has been running the survey and has asked the same question of, how much you trust the police, and the answers being somewhat, a lot, just a little, or not at all. We've sort of seen that there were fairly high levels of distrust in about 2002, fairly low levels actually of that distrust in about 2011, but that number has slowly crept up to where we are now in 2021, where 73% of South Africans say that they don't trust the police and only 26% say that they do.
As far as, I guess, the demographic of this survey, tell us more about the methodology and who was targeted. Do any of these outcomes have any relation to age, race, and socio-economic class and standing in society?
That's an excellent question. So Afrobarometer surveys are undertaken in a way that's representative and weighted for the population. So in that sense, it's the survey respondents, which are about 1,600, are weighted for race, gender, location, urban, rural divide, and many of the other markers, and provincially as well, and many of the other markers of South African society. So in that sense, it's actually a really strong and reliable extrapolation of sort of popular levels of perceptions of many issues within South Africa. And these surveys have also been run 8 times now, from between 2002 and 2021.
What options then do South Africans have if they don't trust the police?
That's also an excellent question. I think that one option is absolutely private security. That's an enormous industry that brings in about 45 billion rand a year in turnover and employs almost 500,000 personnel, be they security guards, administrators, call center workers, etc. So that's one aspect of it. I think what we saw during the July unrest is a far scarier aspect of essentially groups mobilizing, mostly based on race, but also in terms of communities, that came out and essentially were sort of vigilante security forces. So in that sense, I think that there's a part of community safety that could work, and that's sort of centered around community policing forums, neighborhood watches, etc. And then there's, of course, private security. And then there's the far scarier, I think, option, which is around these sort of almost private or community militias where people decide to arm themselves.
Did you actually look deeper, perhaps, into that aspect of people taking their own safety and the safety of their communities into their own hands?
So in this particular survey, that wasn't necessarily what we had asked, but there are plenty of security experts, policing researchers, and criminologists who do actually do the work of essentially trying to figure out why South Africans kind of coalesce around each other, and particularly, I think, sort of turn to vigilantism in many ways. So I immediately think of, for example, the findings of the Khayelitsha Commission back in 2012, that essentially, or 2013, that essentially showed us that many community members, sort of form bonds and groups around taxi drivers, for example, and they become almost a de facto security force where the police are absent. So in this way, I think we're seeing a lot of community-based policing and sort of safety mechanisms, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a good thing, because it could end up for example, mob justice and mob violence in communities like Zandspruit earlier this year, where 8 men were killed in such mob justice.
We spoke earlier on about the perception of corruption. I wonder if, in the midst of the study, you tried to marry the two, perception and reality. What were people's on-the-ground experiences with corruption regarding the cops, perhaps people who found themselves in situations where they paid bribes, for example?
That's an excellent question, and that is also a question that we asked in the survey, where we essentially asked a subset of people, those who had answered yes, and said that they had contact with the police or requested assistance from the police in the past 12 months. And that actually showed some incredibly interesting findings, in the sense that of that group of people who've had contact with the police over the past year, 15% had said that they had to pay a bribe to the police in order to receive assistance from the police. And another 24% said that they had to pay a bribe to avoid problems with the police. So in this sense, there's a sense of corruption, which is quite high. And as I said earlier, I think it's definitely influenced by a lot of what's happening in the leadership of the police. And there's a slightly lower actually lived experience of corruption within the police, and people saying that they've had to pay bribes to receive assistance or to avoid problems with the police. But that is there. There is a real lived experience, especially of corruption and bribery within the police.
So as we wrap up, what immediate reform can citizens and South Africans seek in order to better aid policing?
I think a longer-term solution is definitely a large bureaucratic intervention into the way that the police service runs. At this point, I think we have an incredibly top-heavy structure of the police, and a lot of generals, for example, who are very, very well paid. But that doesn't necessarily filter down to increased performance at the station and at the individual police officer level. So in that sense, we need, I think, a sort of broad reform of the leadership structures, and that includes the position of National Police Commissioner and Police Minister, who I think both need to be, or both positions need to be filled by people who are competent administrators, who understand the very large and complex institution that is the SAPS, and also people who understand policy leadership, because I think that is sorely lacking. I think your average South African at this point should definitely be pushing for competent people to be appointed in those positions.
But also, we'll have to leave it at that, unfortunately, for today. But thank you so much for a really comprehensive report on that. She is Ziyanda Stearman, author of the book, Can We Be Safe? And that's